Are you ready to hear a story that might make you sleep less at night? So stay with us until the end of the video. The close-knit group of friends, Mark, Katie, Lucas, and Claude, had spent countless days immersed in the hustle and stress of city life, so they decided to escape for the weekend and retreat to nature. Their destination was the remote mountains and desolate roads, which seemed to hold nothing but peace and silence. None of them had any idea that this trip would soon transform into an endless nightmare. The road they were traveling on was dark and isolated. Tall, thick trees seemed to stretch from ancient times, casting their shadows over the road. Even the gentle breezes that whispered through the trees strangely muffled the sounds of nature. Everything felt still and silent, as if no life existed in this place anymore. Mark suggested they pull over to the side of the road for a quick rest. Katie wandered a little away from the car and looked around. The trees and shadows seemed to twist and intertwine more with every passing moment. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, something fast and unnatural moved. The shadow darted quickly between the trees and vanished. "Did you see that?" Katie asked the group, her voice trembling. "What?" Lucas asked. "It was probably just the shadow of an animal." But Katie couldn't tear her eyes away. There was something in her gaze that made her doubt what she had seen. No, it was different. It was too fast. Everything appeared normal, but Katie still felt something wasn't right. Soon, the group got back in the car and continued their journey. As night fell, the surrounding environment grew even more oppressive, amplifying their feelings of fear and isolation. The road stretched endlessly before them, with no signs of civilization in sight. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves echoed from a distant corner. The noise was so close, it felt like something was moving beside them. But when they looked, there was nothing. "Do you feel how heavy everything is here?" Claude said, his eyes staring off into the distance. "Forget it. Maybe something just fell from the trees," Mark replied in a calm voice. But this terrifying sound continued. The sound of heavy footsteps grew closer with every passing moment. As they looked around, they felt more and more that they were not alone in this strange dark place. The trees seemed to press closer together, and the light from their flashlights was ineffective. "There is something here," Katie said softly. "We need to go back," Lucas added, his voice trembling and uncertain. But before they could decide what to do, a shadow appeared in the distance. A tall shadow that moved strangely and never fully fell into the light. They immediately got out of the car and headed towards the shadow. The group reached a point where the road turned into a small narrow path. Contrary to their expectations, this path didn't lead them to a beautiful natural spot or a suitable place to stop, but instead took them into a completely different world. The surroundings were dark and mysterious, and there was no sign of a path forward. In the heart of this darkness, Katie accidentally found an ancient inscription carved into a stone. The lines of the inscription were severely worn, and only a few words were legible. The inscription spoke of a forbidden ritual in these catacombs, during which the spirits of the dead were transferred to the shadow world. But in this ritual, a gateway between the world of the dead and the world of the living had been left open, and this opening caused dark beings to enter the human world.
This sounds very serious, Lucas said, his voice full of anxiety. What does this mean? Mark asked, but before anyone could respond, another sound was heard from the distance. It was a rustling sound coming from deep within the forest.
Everyone quickly looked around. The sound seemed to be coming from the heart of the forest and getting closer to them. None of them could figure out where the sounds were coming from. But something was moving in the darkness, something that was getting closer with every passing moment. A deadly and oppressive silence hung in the air. The decision to turn back was made, but only after the group reached a point where there was no way back. It seemed as though the road and the path had mysteriously changed, and there was no sign of an exit from this place they had become trapped in. Suddenly, Katie heard an inhuman scream from a distance, a sound that didn't resemble that of a human, but rather something hellish and supernatural. Whose voice is that? In that moment, something rapidly moved towards them. The trees were bending violently, the shadows moved faster than before, and the sound of terrifying footsteps grew louder. "We have to sacrifice one of us," Lucas said softly, his eyes filled with fear. He was shaking strangely, his hand trembling uncontrollably. This was the hardest and most terrifying decision of their lives. In the end, Lucas volunteered, "I'll do it. I must sacrifice myself to save the others." How scared were you so far in the story? If you really dare, like this video so we can continue the story. The group, terrified of the death of one of their own, witnessed Lucas's sacrifice. He had surrendered himself so that the others could escape this horrific nightmare. With trembling steps, the group exited the tombs, but the weight of the atmosphere continued to press heavily on their hearts. The air was cold and thick, just like it had felt deep within the tombs, but it seemed as though the chill would never leave their bodies. They could no longer forget what had happened there. Blood, screams, and shadows that would never fade from their minds. When they reached the entrance of the tombs, the world around them had changed in a terrifying and unnatural way. The sunlight had dimmed unnaturally, as if the sun itself had been frightened by the terror that lingered in that place and didn't want to shine on the earth anymore. The shadows were taller and darker than ever before. They had all silently turned back, but deep within, they felt they were running from something they couldn't escape. Suddenly, just as they thought they had broken free from the nightmare, the sharp, wild sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They all turned their heads, and in that moment, they saw Claude stepping out from the darkness with slow, silent steps. But he was no longer the same person. His eyes were lifeless and cold, as if his soul had left his body and was trapped in some dark place.
Is it him? Katie asked with a trembling voice, a frightened throat that seemed to crack in the night. It's no him anymore, Mark replied in a voice filled with terror. It's something that came from another world, something we unleashed.
Claude looked at them, but his gaze lacked any comprehension. As he moved toward them, his steps were heavier and slower than ever before. But with each passing second, the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. None of the group members dared to approach him. His cold, lifeless stare filled them with a terror unlike anything they had ever felt. As they moved step by step toward the tomb's gates, Katie's voice trembled as she spoke. Have we returned to our world? Or is this just the beginning of the real nightmare? Even she, who had always been brave and determined, could no longer escape the deep fear growing in her heart. The group continued, but suddenly, in the distance, a shadow stood motionless. As their gaze shifted toward it, none of them could explain what they were seeing. A dark shadow, strangely positioned near the trees, not moving, just watching them. The shadow was more terrifying than anything they had ever encountered in the tombs. Yes, this is what we've been running from, isn't it? Mark asked in a hoarse voice, as though his breath had been trapped in his chest. Katie shivered as she looked at the shadow. We need to leave. This is no longer a place to stay. The shadow slowly began to move. It was a slow, calculated movement, like a hunter who knows exactly when to strike the final blow. They quickly started running, but the shadow continued to follow them, still moving at its unhurried pace. The group reached a point where there was no way back. Mark turned his head toward Claude and saw that he was still staring at them with a lifeless look in his eyes. Claude, this isn't you, it's what's inside you. We have to help him. But no answer came. Claude continued forward, silent and emotionless, as if nothing could stop him. We have to save him, Katie shouted. But before anyone could act, a rustling and howling sound echoed from the distance. It came from the ground, as though it had risen from the depths of earth and stone. A terrifying, rasping noise that seemed to trap their breath in their chests. We have to run, right now! Mark screamed, and the group, filled with dread and fear, ran toward the trees and the dark forest.
But the shadow continued to walk slowly, maintain a distant yet constant pace behind them, as though watching their every move. It seemed like nothing could escape it, not time, not space, and not even their very souls. Everything in this dark world was intertwined, and there was no way to escape this nightmare.
Is this the last time we'll breathe? Katie asked in a trembling voice. The group continued to run, but deep inside, all they felt was fear. This shadow, this dark being, might just be the beginning of even worse nightmares lying in wait within the outer world. With hearts full of doubt and terror, they made their way back to the car. Claude, unable to bear his friend's stunned looks any longer, stared blankly at the horizon. His hands were clenched involuntarily, as if trying to resist something within him, but something external was also beginning to take hold. None of them could tell if this entity inside him was truly Claude's spirit or something else entirely. Claude's shoulders were hunched, and his face appeared strangely lifeless and cold. It was as though he had no feelings or awe for the world around him. The only thing they could see were his empty, soulless eyes, as if he were living in another world altogether. This isn't the same Claude anymore, Katie said in a trembling voice, stepping away from him with every step.
Mark and Lucas followed her, but everything was enclosed in silence and darkness. The group had split apart, not just because of the fear of what they had experienced in the depth of those catacombs, but because of the rifts within them. that had opened in their hearts from the recent horror.
But before they had a chance to truly distance themselves from that point, another strange and terrifying sound echoed. The heavy footsteps, the mysterious rustling and hollow noises in the night began to be heard among the trees and forests that never seemed to be at peace. The sound was so close that it felt as if something was attacking them. A shadow was emerging from the darkness, moving with relentless speed. At first, none of them could tell what the shadow was. All they knew was that something very large and terrifying was moving, something that wanted to escape from the depths of these lost forests and enter the world. "What is that?" Lucas asked, his voice anxious and frightened. Suddenly, a terrifying and inhuman sound echoed from behind the trees. It sounded like a monstrous being struggling to pass through the narrow, crooked walls of the tunnels. The noise was so loud that it seemed as if the very earth and time were collapsing in on themselves. For a moment, the group was paralyzed with fear. "We have to run! It's not safe here anymore!" Mark shouted, running toward the car. But they couldn't escape so easily. The shadows were closing in, and they felt completely helpless and powerless against those mysterious and dangerous forces. The shadow moving in the darkness was silently drawing closer to the group. A few moments later, the shadow became clearly visible to them. In the dim light of the car's headlights, something very tall and black was moving. A shadow that was beyond human comprehension. Its presence trembled in the darkness like a living, unnatural being that approached all living creatures, one by one, dragging them into its unknown world. "My God!" Katie couldn't continue. As she backed away in terror, she fell to the ground. Her legs, paralyzed with fear, lost all strength, and her body seemed defenseless against the being that had emerged from the darkness. In the heart of the night, the air felt heavier than ever, as if even the earth itself had stopped breathing. The face of the shadow was more terrifying than they had imagined. An airy creature with long, black arms that reached forward like demonic horns. Its red, glowing eyes shone from the depths of the darkness, staring with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the soul. It was something that no human should ever look at, something that existed only in nightmares. What will happen to this group? Will they be saved? Stay with us until the end of the video to find out. Claude is still in the grip of the group, suddenly moved toward the creature. His eyes changed from lifeless to a terrifying, glowing state. He could no longer see anything. His body was being pulled involuntarily toward the creature, as if his soul had been taken over and he had no control or will to resist it. His hands spun aimlessly in the air, and his mouth opened silently in terror. "Claude, no!" Mark shouted, running toward him. His heart was squeezed with fear and sorrow, but before he could reach him, the shadow quickly attacked Claude. The creature's speed was so fast that it seemed nothing could stop it. At that moment, a suffocating sound came from Claude's body, as though something was being pulled from within him. The sound of skin tearing and bones breaking under an unimaginable force filled the air. The shadow, with one swift and silent movement, embraced Claude and pulled him into the darkness. Claude's whole body bent painfully in the creature's grip. His gaze toward Mark and the others, devoid of any emotion, shifted from collapse to an unimaginable horror. It was as though His soul was being destroyed in the hands of the creatures, but his body was still fighting in the world of the living. Mark, Katie, and Lucas could only stare at the place where Claude had vanished. The sounds of dreadful footsteps and mysterious rustling began to fade into the darkness. With each step, the shadow sank deeper into the night, bringing with it a slow death. "He's gone," Lucas said in a broken voice. He couldn't even tear his gaze away from the spot where he last saw Claude. Everything inside him had emptied, as though there was nothing left to connect him to the world he once knew. "He'll never come back," Katie added, her voice trembling. She was so terrified that she couldn't even move. Her voice was collapsing like a castle crumbling before a monstrous storm. With a loud scream that came from deep within the shadows, they were forced to flee quickly into the night. This scream, coming from the depth of hell, was no human sound, but the cry of a creature that should never have been heard. The sound was so horrifying and unsettling that hearts raced, and breath were caught in their chests. Their escape was futile. They no longer lived in their safe world. A new world had come for them, one where nightmares became reality and shadows preyed on humans. In this new world, there was no place to escape. There was no way back to the world they once knew. They never returned home. No one knew what had happened to them on that dark night. The only thing that remained was the deathly silence that fell over the area, a place where no one dared to step foot anymore. Only shadows lived in that hell, quietly waiting for new victims. The deadly silence once again ruled the surroundings. The forest remained as dark and menacing as ever. The cars and belongings were left abandoned right where they were. There were no signs of life. Only in the heart of the night, the shadow stood in the distance, watching the cars and what was left of the group. Was this the end of the story, or the beginning of a new nightmare waiting in the heart of this merciless, dark world? Do you think this story is true? Please write your thoughts about this scary story in the comments. As time slowly passed, inhuman moans echoed from among the trees. These sounds not belonging to humans, but to strange and terrifying creatures lurking in the dark forest. The nightmare never ended.